Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. You know, it's fair to state that few U.S. volunteer regiments were as esteemed for their collective strength as the 12th New Hampshire Infantry. It drew strapping young fellows from farms that dotted the Granite State's White Mountains. One of its captains, Asa Bartlett, mused about the origin of the unit's nickname. Quote, no wonder that a regiment having so many giant like men should have been called the New Hampshire Mountaineers. End quote. But not everyone fit that ideal, including the young man pictured here, Samuel Bean Noyes. He was a frail high school student from the village of Meredith on Lake Winnipesaukee. He stood 5 feet 7 inches tall for that time period, without his brogans. Noyes preferred the classroom over the playing field, and so was perhaps something of a surprise when he left school in September 1862 and joined the Union Army. He enlisted in the 12th from a sense of duty, something that Captain Asa Bartlett noted. The officers recognized that Noyes was not exactly combat material from the moment he mustered into the regiment. So they assigned him to duty as a mail carrier, but he didn't mind. Noyes was, in fact, a welcome figure about their camp after they moved to Virginia during the winter as he delivered letters and packages from home to his comrades. Bartlett went on to write the regimental history, put it gently when he referred to Noyes, quote, here is the face of one who entered the service beardless and fragile in looks, but who stood the hardships of active service by being slightly favored at first, end quote. Bartlett and other officers might have been too protective of Noyes. Charles Tripler, an Army physician, argued in his 1858 book titled Manual of the Medical Officer that smart and small soldiers were preferable. He wrote, quote, quickness of perception, enterprise, and intelligence certainly do not depend upon bulk of body, but are found comparatively much more frequently in men of small than in men of large stature. The bulky man, from a consciousness of physical force, due as much to weight as to nerve, may ordinarily possess more physical courage, but the quick-witted, active little fellow, who instinctively makes up by intelligence and address for the difference in physical force, thus training and disciplining his mind, however unconsciously, to meet and grapple with superior strength, will make the best and most reliable soldier, end quote. Noyes would soon prove Tripler right. In May of 1863, after more than half a year as a mailman, his superiors assigned him to regular duty, combat duty. The timing of the assignment was significant. The Mountaineers had lost more than half their number in the recent Battle of Chancellorsville and were in desperate need of men for the front lines. Noyes was one of 224 mountaineers who arrived on the Gettysburg battlefield on July 2nd, 1863. They and the rest of their corps, commanded by Major General Daniel Sickles, took up a position along the main Union line. Sickles, a political general with no formal military training, executed one of the most controversial moves of the three-day engagement when he marched his forces ahead of their assigned place in line. That change created a half-mile gap between his troops and the rest of the Union Army. The Confederates promptly exploited the gap. They poured into the open space and wreaked havoc on the exposed Federals. Quote, in the very center of this terrible conflict stood the 12th New Hampshire Regiment, while thick and fast fell its brave and gallant members, end quote. That statement comes from Gettysburg historian John B. Batchelder. You students of the Civil War, I know, are familiar with that name. The 12th was forced back with heavy casualties and almost lost their colors. Nearly 100 mountaineers, approaching half, were killed or wounded, including Noyes, who suffered a serious gunshot to his shoulder. Noyes and the 12th served through the rest of the war. William F. Fox, in his treatise Regimental Losses in the American Civil War, listed the 12th as one of the celebrated 300 fighting regiments in the Union Army. That's a list of those regiments who saw the most action and experienced the heaviest losses. In grim recognition of that casualty rate, they were assigned to the list. Noyes returned to the regiment after a 4-month recuperation and received his corporal's stripes. But in the spring of 1864, he left the Mountaineers to become a second lieutenant in the 1st United States Volunteer Infantry. This is a newly organized regiment, and it was recruited from the ranks of Confederate prisoners of war who had been confined at Point Lookout prison camp in Maryland. Those who pledged allegiance to the Constitution and traded their ragged gray garments for Union blue were derisively referred to as Galvanized Yankees by Southerners who remained loyal to the crumbling Confederacy. Noyes went home to New Hampshire for a brief visit about this time and sat for his portrait in a Concord photograph studio. And you can see he's an officer here. Note his uniform. See the shoulder straps on his uniform. That indicates he's an officer. The first U.S. volunteers were ordered to the West in the summer of 1864. Part of that was because of those galvanized Yankees. They wanted those ex-Confederates out West not having to confront their own Southern brothers in battle in the Eastern theaters or the Western theaters. So they went further out West. By the summer of 1864, Noyes had advanced to captain and commander of Company B of his regiment. He and his men were ordered to Dakota Territory far out west, where they garrisoned Fort Union, an old trading post located at the confluence of the Yellowstone and Missouri rivers. On November 28, 1864, Native Americans attacked Noyes and a detachment of his company on their return from a trip to supply cattle herders with rations. Noyes suffered a minor wound, the details of which went unreported. Noyes mustered out of the Army in 1865 and settled in Chicago, where he opened a grocery store. However, poor health forced him to close up shop after less than a year, and he returned to New Hampshire. In 1866, he married a woman named Annette Curry. Their union ended in 1870 tragically after Noyes died of tuberculosis. His wife and a son, Harry Lincoln Noyes, assumably named for the president, survived him. Now, that's where the story of Noyes ends, but it picks up for me 113 years later, and I have a connection to it. In 1983, I found this photograph, the one you see here, for sale in the catalog of a Civil War dealer. It was unidentified, but I liked the look of the soldier. His face struck me as someone who had seen something of battle, though I had no more than a hunch. So I purchased the old photo and added it to my small collection. Then, about 10 years later, in 1993, a print of the same image came up for sale in another dealer catalog. Fortunately, Noyes had signed this new print, at least new to me, which enabled me to connect his face and the name. So now I knew who he was. I later verified his identity after finding the same portrait reproduced as a woodcut in the regimental history of the 12th New Hampshire. Then, 7 years after that, in 2000, I began researching and writing my very first book called Faces of the Civil War, an album of Union soldiers and their stories. I decided early on that Noyes would be part of the book. At that time, while I was doing my research and writing, I happened to be working at USA Today. And when the first copy was delivered to my house, I brought it into the office and shared it with my coworkers. The first coworker I shared it with is a researcher. Her name is Ann Carey, and she sat next to me. Anne, super talented, knew everything about the book. I had told her I was writing and working on it, and she asked me from time to time how the book was progressing. So when I handed her the book, she glanced at the cover and, like the researcher that she is, she flipped to the back of the book and began thumbing through the index. There was a moment when she looked up at me with a smile and said, "Noyes, Samuel B." Reading the index. "That's my great-great-grandfather." We were both stunned, silent, looking at each other. And then we began to talk. We started sharing the stories about Noyes. I shared what I had learned in my research, and she told me what she had known from her family history. And together, we both sat and appreciated the slim chance that of the 77 soldier images that I featured in that first book, out of those 77, out of a total of 2.2 million Union soldiers who served, that one of those could be directly related to a coworker, to coworkers who sat side by side each other in the year 2004 when the book finally came out. So there's a story of Captain Noyes and his battlefield wound at Gettysburg, his work in command of Galvanized Yankees in Dakota Territory, and of course, the frail mountaineer who proved himself a good combat soldier. So thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.